Hello, everybody. I hope you all are enjoying Pod Jam 2021. As we're doing intros, everybody drop your favorite Pod Jam moment into the chat. Let's get some hype going. Welcome to your goth friend of Pod Jam 2021. We are the How to Horror Without Being a Dick panel. And I'm so excited to get to know all of our amazing horror panelists. But before, a couple announcements, especially if you're just tuning in. First of all, PodJam is supporting the Trevor Project, which is a nonprofit that does amazing life-saving work with LGBTQ plus youth. So if you learn something during this panel, if you smile, if you scream, do exclamation point donate and donate to our Tiltify account. The live chat has set a fun goal of getting to $666, but I feel like we could even smash that. So donate. Also, keep an eye out in the live chat. The mods will be letting you know how to enter our giveaway. Every panel and game as part of PodJam is giving away a copy of the McElroy Family's Everybody Has a Podcast Except You, a great guidebook from the first family of podcasting. So make sure you enter that giveaway. But to start us off, let's do some spooky introductions and see who we are chatting with. I'll go real quick. I'm Lisa Penrose. I've done horror podcasts for Dungeons and Dragons, what's the actual name of the game? The Good Society. The game is Haunting of Good Society. And also 10 Candles, a bunch of different games that are typically and atypically horror. But let's go. We'll go in the order on the screen here. Cassie, let's start with you.
Hello, my name is Cassie Clark. I'm the GM for the Lovely Craftians, which is a Call of Cthulhu actual play podcast. So horror is our home. That's where we sit. We sit with the cosmic horror, with the existential horror. Everything's bad, but we laugh through it, and that's the best part.
Everything's bad, but oh so good.
So good.
Yeah. And next we have Sage.
Oh, I thought we were going around the other way. So what's up? Hello, my name is Sage. I am a player and showrunner here on the Venture Maidens Twitch channel, where I have run both Descent into Avernus and ran an adaptation of Cobalt Press's Empire of the Ghouls, known as the Rising Hunger, which all of those VODs are available on our Venture Maidens YouTube channel for you to binge.
Lots of spooky content. Next up, we have RK.
Hi, I'm RK Wild. I've run Monster of the Week on the Burn Bunch on Off the Tables channel, and I'm also the producer, director, creator, whatever, of Fear and Living Color.
All right, and last but certainly not least on the screen, we have Norden. Oh, and you are muted.
I'm muted, yeah, of course, because one of us always has to. So I just took that responsibility for me.
Yep.
Yeah,
Thank you.
You're welcome. My name is Norden Ali. My pronouns are he, him. You can find me online at Werewolf Feels. I've been a part of a lot of horror projects. The Burn Bunch, I was on that. A wonderful Fear Itself RPG podcast called Missing Annie Lee, but also a bunch of other horror games found on channels like Roll For It, Utopia, and tons of. I'm a big horror person, and people keep inviting me to urban fantasy stuff, so here we are.
So Missing Annie Lee just completed. So if you want a whole horror story, I promised the producers I'd give them a little shout. So that's Salty Ginger and Summer Matthews. Thank you for producing that awesome horror series.
Produced it. Were amazing GMs. Also shout out to Off the Table and Salty Sweet Games for making that thing. It is 21 episodes, 21 of 2 time period goodness. Let's check it out.
So let's start off with what really is bringing us all here. We love this genre. So what would you say for you is the allure of horror as a genre? And I can either go down in the same order, or we can do the finger raise if anyone wants to interject at any point. But we'll start off going in the order while we all get comfy. So Cassie, we'll start with you.
So there's just something really revealing about the way horror tickles the most core parts of your brain that it's almost universal. Things will usually be creepy for everyone. Dolls that move on their own, absolutely unacceptable for everyone. So it's a great and very telling genre to really explore who people are and what makes them tick in these scenarios when they're really broken down to that core bit of themselves. And I think that's, aside from just enjoying spooky things in general, I think that's probably why I like it the most.
Mm-hmm. What about you, Sage?
I definitely agree on the I'm a big fan of skulls and zombies and all things spooky. I've as a kid I've always loved horror movies, and it's what really brought me to horror is that when it's done very well, it's an exhilarating experience. And there are very few things in life that give you those little heart flutters than when you're like getting to enjoy really good horror. And so I think that is to me why it appeals.
Okay.
This might sound ridiculous, but horror doesn't pull their punches sometimes. With other like classical fantasy stories, you always know the hero is going to win out, like it's always going to be a good day. But with horror, there's always moments where it's like, I don't know if it's how it's going to turn out in the end. And I think that that's part of what I love about horror is the unpredictability of it.
Mm-hmm. I think that's a great point. And especially if I can like add to that a little bit, depending on the game or the system or the type of storytelling the table wants to do, you can lean into the tragedy. 10 Candles, you know it's going to be a tragedy, so you embrace that. And oh my goodness, Celeste has just shared with us that we have hit our $666 goal already, minutes into the panel. Thank you everybody so much for supporting the Trevor Project. I wonder if we can even smash that $750 goal that we raised before Lovely Craftians Live tonight. Fingers crossed. If anyone can do it, this chat can. And Norden, what about you? What's the allure of horror for you?
There is very few things I feel that get a bunch of players immediately as invested as horror can, because it relies so heavily upon description and tension.
Mm-hmm.
So like it has a way of just sucking people in, and any game can do that. I want to be clear, any game can do that, but horror is kind of like, I find it a very, this is going to sound off, it's a cheaper way to do it, because you're already getting them interested in usually something dark, a shock to the senses, bring them into a different reality, and then you start drawing them in with tension because something is on the line, not necessarily their lives, but something. So it's horror is like one of those genres that I think is technically not a genre. It can fit into any sort of setting.
True.
But it's like a format of things you can do to help build a story right at the start.
That immediate shared investment is such a good point. I also want to call out something that Zeb Kusan said in chat, which is that they prefer horror games to other media like movies, just because they have that agency, which I really identify with. I actually can't watch horror movies. And in fact, aside from tabletop role-playing games specifically, not even like video games, I can't do horror as a genre, but it's my favorite genre of tabletop game. And I think it's because I'm empowered as one of the storytellers, which I know we're going to get to as we continue this discussion. But for now, I want to shift us over to the bad and maybe even the ugly of horror actual plays, which is that horror as a genre historically is rife with pitfalls. There are common like mistakes that folks might make as storytellers, and for marginalized gamers especially, the genre can have some unpleasant or even unsafe tropes or themes that a lot of folks are used to leaning on. So let's delve into that. What are some of these common pitfalls? And then we'll talk about addressing them next. Who wants to start with this very weighty question? We're going to do the finger raise for this one. We're graduating. All right, RK.
Honestly, we could do a whole panel just on horror pitfalls. Because you think about fat phobia, racism, sexism, ableism, like any of them, they all show up in horror. Especially with like not only how you treat your monsters, but how you treat your protagonist, especially. If you've watched any horror movies recently, you'll notice that people of color really only feature in roles of service, whether it be the police officer who shows up or the nurse who helps out. They're never the friend, they're never the main characters, except for recent movies that have come out. A lot of horror delegates people of color to lesser roles or treats them as inhuman, especially when it comes to like descriptions of monsters. Monsters being dark or black, and that being the terrifying aspect of it, or pushing like people of color stereotypes onto monsters and making that the part that's feared as an othering experience. Um, Especially if you think about like a lot of movies that have come out that have been like, oh, the scary part of this is you're in an unknown place, but the unknown place is like an actual place in the real world. Like, oh, you're in the forests of Brazil and you meet a bunch of people who are indigenous to the area, and that's the horror. And it's just it's racist. It's racist is what it is. And it really sucks.
Yeah, absolutely. This could be an entire hour of just this question, honestly. I'm particularly interested, Cassie, so you run a Call of Cthulhu actual play. So I imagine that this was a whole own thing for you and your cast. Can you share a bit of that with us?
Yeah, so for those who aren't super into Lovecraftian horror or cosmic horror, its roots are in a very racist, weird man who sucks a lot. H.P. Lovecraft, even for his time, which is what people try to write it off as, even for his time, he was trash. So we started off just from the get-go saying, I don't like any of the descriptions that he has for his monsters. And I might use some of those monsters and tweak the description, obviously, but they have names that I will never say. Not coming out of my mouth. You'll never hear it on the podcast because he's probably like one of the major firsts who really helped set those tropes, those racist tropes of your monsters and of the othering. So it's a conscious effort from the beginning to separate ourselves from that and then say, we're going to do this. Sure. We don't like these parts. We're going to make them better. And I think, honestly, having a couple of our cast members who are women of color, I get a lot of satisfaction out of knowing that he's probably rolling in his grave, knowing that we're like facing off with his monsters. And I like that aspect a lot too. It's like, I get to build space in a thing where that space was so heavily drawn, where Black people are over here. And it's clear that he does not like Black people. And getting to tear down those walls and try to break those constructs is actually really satisfying.
Yeah. I mean, there's something that Celeste Conowitch, who's producing this panel right now, has said a few times that I love, which is just like, I tend not to make a habit of letting like white cis men ruin my favorite things for me. So I really like that energy. Sage, what sort of pitfalls in horror have you had to navigate in your creations?
So definitely with the like my big take, like sort of philosophy on like looking at the genre and how to tell stories is like sort of the my opening line is always, just because you're in a grim dark universe does not mean it has to be problematic. Things can be terrible without oppression. Things can be terrible without othering individuals. There are a number of people are terrible. We can be terrible for a lot of different reasons, but it doesn't have to come from oppression. There are a lot of things that are fundamentally terrifying to the human psyche, and you can find ways to explore those in ways that are that are interesting, that don't have to be involved around like race or class or gender or any of those things. Like, it's, finding those elements that are sort of universal to the human experience that you can take and pull apart and use. And yeah, so I think there are a lot of pitfalls. And that's something that when I was running the Rising Hunger with is, that is a story that is about a ghoul imperium, and ghouls being, these undead creatures who need to cannibalize, the living. And what that looks like written in the book was that, they captured individuals and enlisted them as slaves and then ate them. And talking with my players who, a number of them are people of color, we talked about, I was like, this is in the book. I don't want this in the book. What are ways that we can come together and we can write this to fix it, and find a solution for this, because, I don't want to use that kind of problematic material in our game.
Absolutely. I love that you incorporated your players' feedback as well. Like it isn't all on the DM. But Norden, were you about to say something? I feel like I interrupted you.
No. Well, I'm forming a thought, and the thought actually concerns players as well. So I'm glad that you expanded upon that point, because I think a lot of people think horror is just about scaring your players. And I've been a player for a lot of these things. I've GM'd some stuff privately, but mostly I've been a player in the visible spectrum. And that's the exact opposite of how it should work. Because I said this earlier before, you're trying to draw your players in, you're creating a setting, you're creating a scene, you're like getting that instant buy-in. You're not going to have that buy-in if you're crossing lines of the players. So one of mine, and I don't mind sharing this, this is not a demand that anyone else do so, but one of mine is actually pretty common. It's spiders. I don't know what it is about spiders specifically, not spider webs, just spiders being described in detail, especially if they're interacting with me as a player, that causes me to break out of game. But the fact is, it does happen. So a lot of people think about that and think, oh, then you're scared. That's perfect. That's what I'll use to scare you. But what you're really doing is you're taking Norden Ali, you're taking Werewolf, and pulling him out of the equation so I can deal with whatever I'm processing with, instead of pulling me in. You can do that instead by finding something that I'd be usually otherwise comfortable or familiar with and twisting it, or taking something that is still frightening and drawing it in instead. I always tend to give this example, like if you really want something spidery, try scorpions. Those are terrifying. Those things swarming you are terrifying. And I am drawn in instead of pulled out.
Oh, scorpions even scarier now that I think about it.
Mm-hmm.
Oof. So I'm hearing from a lot of folks that there are just, it's almost like there's so many pitfalls in horror. It's like, how do you even really talk about it? So before we move on to how to address these pitfalls, I'd love if someone were able, like maybe if we focused in on like one horror monster trope that folks might not realize is problematic. And kind of for the folks in chat who might not realize how ingrained in horror these tropes are, if someone's comfortable doing that.
I mean, the savagery and anger issues of werewolves comes to mind.
Oh, really? Can you expand on that a little bit?
Well, okay, so as I go by werewolf feels in the internet, I'm not subtle about this. But I find a lot of things of myself akin to wolves, which is why I pull to that and put that as a Twitter handle that no one will ever let me get rid of now. But when it comes to the way a lot of werewolves are portrayed, one, they're very tribal, and I'm using that word on purpose, which beyond like what they're drawing from initially, in terms of historical record or whatever, you're already bringing to images minds of often Native Americans or First Nations folk. On top of that, the so-called savagery in which they interact has, again, kind of scary similarities with how people treat Native folk, with how people treat Black and Brown folk as well. And then you have the anger issues. And one, like the anger issues, for those who don't know, that's a common thing attributed to Black and Brown men especially. You get it with Black and brown women as well, especially if they're defeminized instead of exoticized, which is one of two tracks that often goes down. But the anger issues really go into that mark, especially with the whole alpha thing that you're now adding on top of it. One of those alone isn't necessarily a bad thing. It's when you put them all together that you start developing a myriad of stereotypes around people of color specifically. And you're relating them to monstrous beasts. It especially is hilarious considering wolves in the wild are nothing like that, right? They form packs, which are family units. The alpha male is just usually the dad. There's this great story from if you look up wolves in Yosemite, you'll find this one about an alpha male in Yosemite his favorite thing in the world was to get into play fights with the cubs and pups and then dramatically lose to them.
Oh,
because that taught them to have confidence and also taught them how to fight without necessarily endangering anyone. It's brilliant if you think about it. Of course, he made it dramatic because that was his personality, I guess, as a wolf. But like that's how wolves interact in the wild. And you pull from that, and suddenly you have this group of people who, if they are set up against you, they're more organized than you could ever be. Mm-hmm. Right? Also, you have abilities to tell stories about wolves and the dangers they face, et cetera, et cetera. Like it's one of those things where people don't often see werewolves falling into really bad tropes, but beyond the toxic masculinity, but they do. They fall into a lot of them. And, when putting them in your game, and they're a common monster, you got to really think about what exactly are you trying to portray featuring these people, because they're still people half the time. And what does it say about how your players and you view the world in which you've created them?
Werewolves are such a common horror creature. So that's like a particularly enlightening example. Also, I now can't get out of my head werewolf that won't stop telling dad jokes.
Oh my God.
Which just thank you personally from me to you. But that's also a great transition over to what makes an amazing horror game. I'd love answers to that in general, but also if you've specifically addressed any problematic things in horror, I would love those examples as well. Would anyone like to start us off with this one? That little finger boop. All right, I'm going to call on someone now. Cassie, we'll start with you.
Sure. So let's see. I actually really do like 10 Candles. I've listened to several different podcast takes on 10 Candles. I prefer the sort of bleaker horror, which is why that appeals so much to me. You have a finite amount of time and everything is ticking down and it's just building and building this tension. And I've found that the people who do the best, or the groups that do it the best, are the ones who have played together for a while, so they know where each other's lines are. And it's the groups who've also had conversations ahead of time and said, all right, here's where my lines are today. Here's where I'm doing this. I'm okay here. I'm not okay there. I'm just scrolling up to look at your question again. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's just the ones that communicate and the ones who give each other the floor too, to really let their characters be horrified for a while. Those are probably the most fun versions to me.
Mm-hmm.
So for me, what makes an amazing horror game, even if you're not the one running the game, knowing that safety tools are in play can make a very, very good game. Because even though there's still horror happening, that everyone's being safe. That's something that I use in all of my games now, even if it's not a horror game. I've even started using it with friend groups. I've been like, hey, we need to have better communication on certain things. We're using the safety tool now. So that's something that's great, but also tension. Like, tension is something you can build without going into any of these sort of pitfalls. shout in the distance. I mentioned this off screen, but deer in the middle of the road that just stares at you for a while, then runs off. People not being around, like it being quiet and dark at home when you arrive when people should be there. Like there are so many different ways you can build horror and tension without falling into those pitfalls.
Mhm. Norden, what about you? What do you think makes an amazing horror game?
I think Sage wanted to say something, and I got
Oh,
my point.
yeah. Sage, please chime in.
So I think I've gotten like questions from people who say like, so as players and like as people, you know, going into any system, you know that like D&D, for example, we know that ghosts are in the monster manual. We know that zombies, that all of these creatures are in the monster manual, and going in with that knowledge of like we could encounter these things. And so a lot of people felt like, well, you know, how do I introduce these things if people know that they could be there and that, you know, they exist? And Arcade made an amazing point. It's about tension. It's about these like subtle things that aren't quite right. It's about like getting to these points where you can see the problem, but maybe the players aren't quite sure how to respond or to solve it, and to let them sort of like flounder in that for a little bit, but then also knowing when to release that tension, and to take those bright moments that allow that tension to release, so that you can go back deeper into it. And I think that's a really important thing too, is that, you know, let your players be goofy and laugh a little bit. You know, because it helps them get back into it when they are ready. And I think some of the, like, one of my favorite moments that I've had in one of my games is when my players, where they encountered a lost dwarven civilization where all of the dwarves were there, but like, and their souls were trapped in their bodies, and the dwarves were trying to communicate with them, but when they spoke, like, no words happened, but they were trying to, you know, going about this mimicry of life, of like doing their regular tasks as if they were still alive and operating, and that was horrifying to them. That the fact that they saw that these people were trying to reach out but couldn't communicate. And so finding those moments where your players will gravitate towards something and lean into that.
Yeah.
I am so glad Sage went before me. So glad. Because okay, so imagine it like this. You're filling up a bar labeled tension. Everything you do fills up this bar labeled tension. Eventually you reach the top of that bar, but there's still more tension to be had. How do you fix that? Because otherwise you're stuck at the top of the bar and nothing interesting is happening, right? The tension is watching the tension bar go up. You inject humor, you let them laugh, and then the bar goes down, and then you can fill it back up again.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
So many people don't take advantage of that, and it makes me sad because, one, yes, it helps your players. Like I think Cassie mentioned before, it's great if the players know each other, and one of the great ways to get that to happen, if they don't beforehand, is to let them joke around with each other, let them loosen the bar a little bit, so you can watch it go back up. But it's also just like, it's super fun to see what people come up with if you let them. And it takes pressure off of you, which allows you to do more thinking and planning. Because as someone brought up, timing is hard. And timing is one of those things in horror that really does matter. You can't have long stretches of nothing unless you intend to have long stretches of perfectly banal emptiness. Slow burns don't work unless they're burning towards something, and you can see that something slowly coming in front of you, like a deer in headlights, as Arcade said it. Yeah. The other thing is what Arcade said. It's all about communication. You have to be able to communicate not just about what you don't want, but what you want to, right? So like, that's why I say, I don't like spiders, make them scorpions instead. And that's why GM will say stuff back like, what would you want to see from this game? And that kind of back and forth helps you build something that's both horrifying but also really fulfilling for everyone around the table.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I feel like I've seen a lot of discussion on Twitter about folks who want to have horror games, want to have grim games, and they ask like, well, how do I make everyone be serious? I want like a serious game. And I've always been a big supporter also of you need like I appreciate those moments of levity, but Norden, you zeroed in on why those are so important because like you said, you can hit that fill up that tension bar, let some of it go and fill it up again. That's such a perfect way to describe that. But all of you talked about tension in some way, so I'm wondering if we can really dial into that. What exactly is it that makes a moment tense? How do you, if you're a new horror GM and you're just like, well, how do I make tension? What would your advice to that person be?
Take something normal and change it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, 100%.
Take something normal and change it. As simple as that. There's a road into town, and on the side of the road is a old broken down school bus. That immediately brings up so many questions. Why is there a broken down school bus here? Why is it like shattered and covered in grass and other things as you're going into town? Like, take something normal and change it. You go into town, let's say it's a fantasy world, you go into town, everyone's windows are boarded up. Immediately that makes things more tense.
Mhm.
Why is everyone's windows boarded up? What's going on that they know about that we don't? Just taking those small things and like changing it and making it off. And it doesn't have to be something super dramatic. It can just be like, oh, there's a fire lit in the room, but it's cold here. It can be the fact that the wind is whistling. One of the small things that someone mentioned to me a while back was just like personify nature a bit. Like the fingers of the trees reach down.
Mhm.
Like rather than calling them branches, just little description things you can do as a GM to build that tension. And then let your players explore and find things that bring up more tension.
Sort of that eerie feeling, like something's off, but you don't know what, or your character doesn't know what.
I definitely think that like, yeah, it's part of like building off of that. It's all about discovery. It's all whenever I give descriptions in a game, whether it's a horror based game or it's just a regular game, my descriptions always go like left, right, center of what a character will see when they like walk into a room or they step into a setting. And it's about picking those little anchor points in a scene to grab their attention, to say like, here are 3 things in this scene that like you can go in and continue to investigate or interact with, and finding those small anchor points draw people in. And suddenly when you take those little snippets and then you can build on them. So if they've noticed this in a room that is completely full of dust, but this perfect and pristine like vase of flowers sits on this on this like vanity, well, where else can they go to like they know where they might notice like trails of petals or the dust of those kinds of flowers of pollen somewhere, like, and finding in those little hints and using them and reinforcing them helps build that sort of like rising climax of like coming to the discovery of something. And that really helps, it helps put the players on a track themselves, because now they're going to start looking for those kinds of like clues and hints. And so it really helps just generate the story for the players in their mind too.
Yeah, no, I'm kind of like in love with this talk right now. But there's two different kinds of tension in my mind. There's the shock tension, and you get this a lot in movies with like shock value. There's a monster behind you, oh no, or roll for damage, but you don't know where it's coming from. And there's building tension, and neither one is bad, but you really do want to mix it up. One of the ways to do building tension really well is to start off really small, creep up, and start by taking something completely banal and that they take for granted away from them. So if you go into a house, you flick on the lights aren't working, right? And the more you slowly build up stuff like that, the more you will like fill up that bar just a little bit, inch by inch. And if you mix that in with something heavy tension, like some shock value tension, you're like you're literally building a haunted house at that point. Because that's what they do. And you can actually really take inspiration from like LARPs and stuff. This is kind of bleeding into other questions, but so I'm not going to get too into it.
Yeah.
Oh, you can actually take inspiration from LARPs and stuff where the way they set a stage is to remind you of something in the back of your head. And they accomplish that way through cues that you wouldn't necessarily think to call out, like scent or subtle shifts in light, or a painting being in a slightly different place the next time around. Especially when it comes to like games that require a lot of rolls, like you're looking at World of Darknesses or your D&Ds, that's how you get to incorporate those rolls in and build in that tension through there, because it's the people who get the rolls who notice something off. And the great part about horror, I find, is that your players will vote to roll for you. You don't need to ask them to do it. They'll be like, can I look around something? Please, please. If it's a looser game like Monster of the Week, it's a little bit harder, but you can still achieve it just by saying, well, okay, what do you want to notice? And if they're like, I'm going to stare at that wall, well, there's a different painting there than there was 10 seconds ago.
I don't know if folks can tell how affected I am by just horror things in general, because I'm like really scared and like very viscerally reacting to everyone's examples. But Sage, I saw you just unmuted.
Oh God, what was I going to say? Yeah, I think, and I think something that's just underutilized in D&D in general is your passive traits. With someone with a high passive perception, they're going to notice a lot of things out of the corner of their eyes. Use that, like use those passive skills, because like Norden said, people are going to want to roll, but what do they notice when they don't roll? What do they hear? What do they see? What do they feel? I think that is a great way to set mood and tone that'll help your players be serious and be in the moment. Yeah.
And don't be afraid of failed rolls. Failed rolls can build tension like nothing else, because especially if they're back to back to back and they just keep failing and you're like, okay, well, you don't see anything. You don't hear anything. It's probably fine. Keep going. Keep looking. Everything's fine. Like, just let them build it. You don't even really have to do anything on that end.
It's just, I hate it when that happens, but I love it when it happens.
As a player, it's the worst. As a GM, it's just chef kiss. Love that.
Because they just drive themselves into the horror at that point, because they're like, what's going on? What's happening here? What am I not noticing? And then they just bring up the tension themselves. They're much more concerned afterwards.
Yep.
I actually noticed a common trait among some of our examples that I want to point out, and I think someone in chat is slowly catching on to it. Give or take qualities from things that shouldn't be there. So you have an object moving on its own when it shouldn't be able to self-automate, or you have an object that should be moving but is extremely still. Like if a swing set is literally not moving a microscopic centimeter in each direction, something is wrong and you know it. And that's a great way to build some of that unsettling tension. I'm getting ideas from this panel.
Yeah, I'm just sitting here like, why did you call out that the swing set wasn't moving? Should I be concerned? And the answer is yes. Another thing that you all brought up, and things that make an amazing horror game, or at least that multiple folks brought up, was the presence of safety tools. So for whoever wants to start us off, can you give us like a brief explanation of what safety tools are? And then I would love to chat with folks about what specific safety tool systems you use or have used for your games. Who wants to define safety tools for us? And I'll go ahead and dance. Oh, Cassie raised
now
a
we're all just
finger.
competing.
Yeah, the official finger raise.
So safety tools, I get this mostly as a joke. People start off where it's like, oh, it's like kink. You've got to like tell each other what you're into and what you're not into. And that is a joke, but it's also very true. It's what you're consenting to doing, and it's how you keep yourself as a GM safe. It's how you keep your players safe. Terrible things happen to characters. That's fine. You don't want those terrible things bleeding into your players because they have to go home after this and sit with that for a while. So safety tools can run the gamut from things that you do before the game, things that you do during a game, and things that you do after a game is like to keep the kink thing going on as aftercare, essentially. So for my tables, we do a session 0 sort of thing. Everyone fills out a consent form for TTRPG things. Here's red light, yellow light, green light of what I'm okay with, and a whole list of things that they can go down and say, yeah, I'm here. Go ahead for body horror. Don't hurt animals. Fine. Hurting animals, I will start crying if I have to describe that. So we're just not going to do it. Fine by me. So it's a lot of that material. During a game at the table, we have an X card system. So they can, or like a red yellow system. Yellow's a warning, like, hey, maybe we should fade to black on this and be done. Red is a hard stop. And whatever scene is going on, it doesn't matter. It ends immediately right there. And then if we need to talk about that, be like, hey, okay, so what about it was this? So I avoid this in the future. Cool. If we need to give you time to think about it and we just stop for a bit, also fine. So it's that varying degrees of that for each table. And I don't want people to think that the consent form is just like a one and done thing. It's important that it's iterative. You could have a bad week where you just can't handle this stuff today, and that's fine. But you have to also communicate that, like just putting that out there. But it's especially important for horror games because you are, I don't want to use the word preying on those sort of things, but you are hammering on these buttons to tell your story, and you need to make sure that people are okay going into it and that they're okay at the end of it. That was very wordy. Sorry.
Oh no, great explanation. Are there any other safety tools that folks have in their toolbox? Okay.
So just as a general safety tool thing, I will always plug this. You can find a bunch of safety tools in the TTRPG Safety Toolkit as made by Kiana, co-curated by Kiana Shaw and Lauren Bryant Monk. It is an incredible resource that gives you the tools and lets you know, hey, here are these tools. You can go ahead and pick the ones that are best for you. So I personally, like Cassie, use X and O cards. I use the Session 0. I also use the open door policy, which I've changed a little bit from what it says in the safety toolkit. I've just changed it to, if you need to get up, you can get up. The safety toolkit lists it as just for like safety reasons. I personally use it for anything, whether it be bathroom breaks, you need to grab something from downstairs, whatever, just get up and go do it. The other thing that I use is I also use a aftercare system, as we said. I use stars and wishes. Basically, players get to say, here's something I really liked about this session as a star, and here's something I would like in the future, whether that be for your character, as a player, with the whole story in general, etc., etc. And the reason why I really like that is because it lets everyone kind of sit after the game for a moment and like reflect on the entire session, say the things they like, get compliments from other players saying like, I really like this scene with your characters, and then also think about like where they want the story to go, which helps out your GM because then your GM knows what to throw at you or where to push the story towards. So that's one of my like favorite safety tools. But like one other thing that I always think should be a conversation when it comes to horror games is what type of horror are you talking about? Because there's a lot of different types. There's Monster of the Week where your players play basically superheroes in a sense who are fighting the horror, and there are other games like Call Cthulhu where your players will be destroyed by the horror eventually. And it can be very important to establish like what type of horror are we doing? Are you expecting to survive this? Like, do you want to fight back against it? Do you want to win? Or do you want to just try and survive? And I think that's very important.
I agree with what pretty much everyone has said. Another thing I'd like to add is this sometimes is useful, sometimes it's not. And I think that's a common thing amongst most safety tools. Sometimes they're the right ones for you, and sometimes they're not. That's okay, but that just means you got to deep dive into that toolkit and find a different one that works. Especially as you're dealing with like neurodivergencies and different ways of processing information, or a text game as opposed to a voice game. But one of the things I like to think about is open secrets. When games rely a lot on, especially on political tension, which can be horror in its own way, or some gritty games, I always like to open up the floor with, do we want to tell each other our secrets and then have to deal with the ramifications of it later, or do we want to try and keep that behind the curtain? And how comfortable are we with lying to each other about what's in those secrets? The reason why is because horror can sometimes rely upon, this is not going to sound great, but sometimes rely upon a little bit of gaslighting, where you're convincing someone something is there that is not there, or you're convincing them that something is not there where it's there. I think, so if anyone who's watched LA by Night here before, you'll notice that Jason Carl, who's the storyteller of that game, always says the phrase, I'm just making a little note, right? Are there always notes being made? Someone also brought up like roles behind the screen for no reason. Those are, in a way, gaslighting. You're convincing your players that there's information to be found there that there isn't, which is okay if everyone's on board with it. You need to make sure that that conversation, in my mind, is held beforehand. I personally also like open secrets in general, because you get to have other players jump on and try and push your secret to opening, or help you try and keep it closed. So if I am a werewolf and I don't want the characters to know, I might tell the players so they know to be oblivious whenever possible, right? Which, as you can probably tell, I've done quite a lot because I play a lot of werewolves. Arky's just laughing because I've literally done it to them. It's when we're talking about communication, one thing we often neglect is, what kind of tactics are you comfortable with? And I think with horror specifically, it is one to keep in mind, especially if you have people there with their own personal trauma that can be impacted by that kind. You don't want your players to lose faith in you, the person, or the storyteller. You want them to lose faith in the narrator you're playing. Sometimes.
Sage, I'll let you add to our safety tools discussion in a moment, but I just wanted to say thank you again to everybody who is donating. We just passed $700. We're at 702, so close to that 750 goal. If we don't hit that, this panel, which I think we still can in the last 15 minutes or so, we're certainly going to smash that in the Lovely Craftians live session coming up next. But thank you everyone for supporting the Trevor Project. Sage, did you have anything to add to the safety tools discussion?
Yeah, I mean, the kind of what we do is I start every game, I send out a Google sheet that has lines and veils that people can fill out anonymously, and then we'll go through, and when we're session 0, we'll talk about those lines and tools and lines and veils, and then if anyone wants to expand or be more descriptive about what they've put down, so we can get a little more nuance on what can and can't be talked about or shown, and stuff like that. And then just during streams, I always do the red, yellow, green system, and then I think just really reiterating of just how important aftercare is to be able to get that feedback from your players and have the feedback from amongst the players together about how they felt like going through that situation, what maybe they felt was unclear or frustrating, or what they loved or what they want to see more of. And I think definitely having that opportunity for feedback after some time for reflection is so incredibly helpful, and so important.
Yeah, I mean, I think things that multiple folks brought up between all of your responses were that aftercare session, and also revisiting the things you do in that session 0. And Norden specifically bringing up how you want to treat secrets at the table. I'll call out D Yellow Flower says sometimes in-game lying can really bleed into people's relationships with and trust in each other unintentionally. And that, honestly, that's something I've experienced with myself and my fellow cast members in games, and like if like there was a secret that someone's hiding from someone else's character, you can unintentionally feel betrayed, even though you know it was part of the game. Like, how could they hide that from me ever, even in character? Maybe that's something you talk about at an aftercare session. You get those feelings on the table. Maybe you decide, well, moving forward, we're all going to be really open about our secrets because we don't even want this moving forward. And you didn't know that was going to be a thing before. So all of these safety tools, super important. I did, let's see, gosh, we have 10 minutes left. How do I want to use this time? Let's do our bonus question because I think it can influence games and inspire games so much, which folks was what non-tabletop media inspires your horror games the most? Norden, I know that you mentioned LARPs and how you can utilize that in horror games. Were there any other media you wanted to call out?
You can use video games as well. Think about someone who's trying to transcribe what you're seeing in a video game or movie. What are they writing down? And then find a way to relay that information to your players. Because sometimes it's just you're walking down an empty hallway. There is water pressing in on all sides of this little glass tube. And you keep walking. And you can, like it just did, you can convey that to your players and recreate that feeling without necessarily having, you know, maps or images or the like. So when you're, if you're really inspired by something, try writing down exactly what you're experiencing, because that'll give you some influence to help influence others to do the same thing.
Does anyone else have favorite media? Sage?
Definitely my favorite go-to is I'm a big metalhead, so I listen to a lot of power metal. And so that's definitely one of the big inspirations for me. Living in the Bay Area and being surrounded by so many opportunities to walk around in beautiful like sequoia and redweed tree forests, like taking time to walk in nature and spending time listening to what ambient noise is, I think helps set a great baseline for when you can modulate what people notice or don't notice in their games to help, you know, create that tension, and taking that practice to be just quietly aware in spaces. Yeah.
For myself, biology. Like, the animal kingdom is horrifying. And if you do a little research on the animal kingdom, you will find so many beautiful moments of horror. For example, one of my favorite facts in the entire world is that a caterpillar, when it makes a chrysalis, explodes and eats itself, and 3 cells that exist in its spine turn into a butterfly. That's horrifying, but that makes it so incredibly interesting if you're making a monster based on that. Of, you've defeated this monster, it exploded, and it's all dead everywhere, but it's actually just going through a metamorphosis and changing into a new creature after it apparently died. Like,
that would be so metal if you're fighting something and it explodes and eats itself.
Like, biology is horrifying, and it's one of those great things that I pull inspiration from. Norden knows this. Norden's seen some of my monsters before. And the other thing is music for me. Music very much pulls a lot of inspiration for things. And there are a lot of people who make great instrumental albums that just have such good tension in them that I just love it. It's so good.
What about you, Cassie?
So any great storytelling, whether that's a TV show or a movie or a book, that I will see like, oh, this really scared me. Why did this scare me? What about this really did it for me? And not how can I rip this off? It's more like how can I use this to inform what I want my game to be, or what's sitting in my head and will not leave me alone until I do something with it. And then Another source is usually folklore, because folklore gets freaky fast and it doesn't take much to make it horrifying. So that's a great place, especially for like one shots for holidays. I love taking just a piece of folklore and messing with it. Baba Yaga, yeah, that chicken hut is coming for you. Have fun with that. So stuff like that. Go back to your
Yule
storytelling
lads.
roots. Yeah, the Yule lads are terrifying. They're great. I've used them before. 10 out of 10.
Perked
Loved
up.
it.
I mean,
Yeah,
the classic Hansel and Gretel.
classic.
It uses everything we say because you come across something that should not be there, and that's
And
what
yes,
In our last 5 minutes, I'm going to see if I can jam in one last question, which is, so this isn't just the How to Horror panel. This is specifically Podjam's How to Horror panel. Does anyone have any advice for doing horror well, specifically in podcast?
Use your soundscapes. You have a medium here that you don't get out of reading a book. You can use background sound. I have a soundboard, and there have been a couple of times where if I'm in the chat with the lovelies and I really want to scare them, I just hit a button on the soundboard and it makes a really terrifying sound. 10 out of 10. Love that. Voice modulation, great. As long as
Editing
like
is-
everybody's okay with it. But like, yeah, you can make some really scary sounds.
yeah, editing is your friend. Like, not just in the sense of like with your players, but also for your audience. Like, you can edit things and change things, change audio and how it sounds. Also, don't be afraid to do retakes. If you're doing, even if it's a game, you can ask a player like, hey, that didn't sound like you were actually afraid. Can you do that again? Just like a little bit more afraid, and then cut that in. Like, you can also like Cassie said, add in sounds, add in music, add in things that like increase the tension. If you're going to describe a stair creaking, put the sound in. Put the sound of a creaking wooden stair as you're talking about the players walking up. Like, just those little things. It doesn't have to be super overproduced, but like just a little bit of production value can go a long way.
Use sound to play with negative space. A lot of podcasting can feel really snappy. You're jumping on one after the other. You're trying to get rid of those little bits of silence. But that breath, that silence, that helps make up horror. You just need to make sure that there's something backing it so people know that their app hasn't exploded. As long as you do that, play with that timing and take the time to take your time, because horror is built in some really slow moments at times.
Great advice. Sage, did you want to add anything to that?
Oh man, that pretty much nails it all. But having, whether it's writing long form descriptions of places or writing bullet points, but finding whatever system that works for you so that you can convey what's in your mind's eye to your players is one of the best and strongest things that you can do to really reiterate theme and tension and setting and everything.
Absolutely. Those key like moments, where you're going to hit in that session, having that prepped in some way, because description is so key. Well, with that and all of those wonderful wisdoms you all shared, we're going to get ready to do some outros and lead into our last break before today's last event. Cassie leading the lovely Craftians through a live Ghost Bros horror episode.
It'll make sense, I promise.
We'll see some of these tips in action. But thank you again to everyone who donated to the Trevor Project. If you feel like you learned something today, even for your podcast or even your home game, your horror home game, please donate $5 to help LGBTQ plus youth. We're going to do outros in backwards order. So tell folks who you've been, where they can find you. We'll start with Norden.
Oh dear, I go first. Hey, my name is Norden Ali Kadir. My pronouns are he, him. You can catch me online and all the things, Twitter, yada, 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 at Werewolf Feels. You can catch my work, although I did go by a different name those days, but it's still my name. You can use it. Over on Missing Annie Lee, 21 episodes of goodness, but also on various other streams. I literally just came from Roll For It. We're playing a mage game of more horror. So, everywhere. Find me everywhere.
Thank you, Norden. RK.
Hi, I'm RK Wild. You can find me as the GM for Off the Table's Burned Bunch. You can also find me on Twitter at Russ Wildest. You can find my show at Fear in Living. And if you want something that's not horror, that's actually all ages, you can find my other podcast at Prism Pals, all on Twitter.
Fantastic. Sage.
You can find me at Staffa Sage on Twitter. I post weekly about all the projects I'm doing and working on and shows that I'm running and everything. Don't have anything going on right now, but coming up soon, we'll definitely be working on having another actual play coming up on our Venture Maidens channel here.
And Cassie.
Yes, you can catch me anytime at the Lovely Craftians. I'm the game mistress. We are actually playing live up next, 15 minutes from now, a mere 15 minutes from now, where we're going to have some horror, we're going to have some fun, going to be a good time for a good cause. You can find me on Twitter at lovelygm_Cassie or at Lovely Craftians. And we have a very bingeable 4 seasons on any of your favorite podcatchers. So if you feel like catching up, it's there.
And I am Lisa Penrose. You can find me personally at Lisa Penrose pretty much everywhere. I'm also going to shout out Penwitch Studio that is organizing and throwing this event. Follow us on Twitter at Penwitch Studio. We are a lovely podcast network for the Lovely Craftians. And for my own podcast, Behold Her Podcast, where I chat with a bunch of femmes in the tabletop role-playing game realm. Stay tuned for the rest of Pod Jam today. I can't wait to see us smash that goal. Bye, everybody.